Welcome to Chautauqua People. My guest today is Linda Steckley. Linda is a native of Lockport, New York, spent the bulk of her childhood in the outskirts of Philadelphia. She did her undergraduate work at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and earned an MBA from the University of Miami. She headed up the community chess program in both high school and college. After being heavily involved in two unsuccessful political campaigns, she realized that her interest truly lay in fundraising for nonprofits. This led to institutional advancement appointments at the University of Miami, NYU, and Duke, and the nonprofits of Brookings and Chautauqua Institution. Linda, how did you make your way to Chautauqua?
Well, I actually came to Chautauqua the first time because Brookings sent me here. For many years, Brookings and Chautauqua have worked together with speakers representing Brookings speaking at Chautauqua. I was sent to Chautauqua to do the planning for a week on Russia, which was to be week 1 of 2006. I was on the grounds for 2 days, went back to Washington and said to my husband, I think I've found the place I've been looking for all my life.
Wonderful.
And we've been coming ever since. That was 15 years ago.
Great. Now, how did that week go with Russia?
It was an excellent week. It was a follow-on 20 years after Chautauqua had done a trip to Russia. A number of Chautauquans went to Russia, which was still behind the Iron Curtain, and a number of Russians actually came to the grounds and stayed with Chautauqua families. So this was 20 years later. Everything had changed in Europe, and it was taking a good look at the countries of the former Soviet Union and the relationship with the U.S. At that time.
Mm-hmm. So that was a significant event for Chautauqua and for everybody concerned, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. And we had just recently returned from a study, we at Brookings had returned from a study tour to Russia. So we had a number of viable contacts in the Soviet Union or in Russia that we could then bring and did bring to speak at Chautauqua. Strobe Talbot, the president of the Brookings Institution, had been involved in the trip 20 years earlier. So this was a good follow-on.
Mm-hmm. I remember him when he was here at Chautauqua during that week, 2006.
Right.
And magnificent questions and follow-on to comments that were made. Now, can you tell me a little more about Brookings, where it is, and what sort of things they do?
Brookings is what's called a think tank, and it is one of the largest and more well-known think tanks in Washington, D.C., where there are more than 200 think tanks in Washington. Brookings is nonpartisan. It has been around since 1916, founded by Robert Brookings, and the principle behind it was that decisions in Washington needed to have input from business, education, and government. So it was designed to convene people from the government, people from academia, and people from the business world to talk together prior to the government making decisions.
Right. Now, Brookings is a nonprofit, and your career was in philanthropy. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the role of philanthropy with respect to nonprofits.
Well, the word philanthropy actually means humanity.
Mm-hmm.
So philanthropy is the word that we use to describe efforts to improve the quality of life. And I think this evening we'll talk specifically about the United States and the role of philanthropy in the U.S. But we talk about usually private philanthropy, which is individuals making gifts to organizations, not-for-profit organizations. But there is also corporate philanthropy. Corporate philanthropy usually has a rationale that will improve the image or the goodwill of the corporation making the gifts. And there then is also public philanthropy to improve the public good. Communities, which of course government structures are not for profit, and there are often fundraising activities in communities to improve the quality of life for the citizens.
Mm-hmm.
But primarily the world that I have been involved with is private philanthropy, so individuals, sometimes organizations or corporations who invest in the world of of private not-for-profits.
Now, how do these private non-for-profits compare to government agencies? Do they do a better job from your perspective?
You know, there's an important role for both, I believe, in our country. The private sector is so important, and the government has a role for the big picture in our country, providing the basics, healthcare, transportation, infrastructure, but it's the not-for-profits that really can make a difference in those underserved communities in our country, in the arts in our country, in education, which is all, of course, is basically not-for-profit, public education, that is. Much of higher education is also private, and the role of philanthropy in an organization like the Chautauqua Institution is critical. At Chautauqua, for example, 20% of the support to keep Chautauqua running has to come from philanthropy. The gate passes that people purchase to come to Chautauqua just doesn't cover the cost of providing the programming that we enjoy all summer.
Okay. Now you have had this wonderful, rich experience, both the academic world and these nonprofits. How long do you normally work with somebody before a major gift comes along?
You know, you've hit on something that is one of my favorite topics, because a donor, once engaged, should become a lifetime donor. And the key there is identifying what's important to the donor, identifying and building a relationship, that what's important to that donor and how do you continue to keep that person engaged. But the whole world of philanthropy builds upon itself. For example, I know, John, that you and your family are philanthropists, and that you, I believe, started at Chautauqua, but it has grown from there. And I wondered, turn the tables a little on the interviewer and ask you, for example, why was that important to you and to your family?
I think the Chautauqua Institution, as we would say, was where we had values that were formed in our family. And Chautauqua, the joke saying that favors the best of human values but doesn't articulate any values. And indeed, that's where they were discussed over the dinner table and on a porch. And if we had been steamed in some 1045 lecture, to come back and talk about it and deconstruct it, or say, yes, we think the lecturer was, grudgingly say that person was on point, or indeed we believe they were mistaken, and here's why.
Well, I think you hit on the key to philanthropy, and that is values. The values of the individual, the values of the family, and where do you place importance in your life. I think that those of us who come to Chautauqua year after year think a lot about values, and that's why most Chautauquans, in fact, are philanthropists. Describe the experience that you have had and why that has been satisfying to you.
In particular, the lectureship.
Yes.
Some years ago, I was overseas. My brother established this lectureship, and we contributed a significant amount of money to the institution. And then the institution finds a lecturer. We have a luncheon with that person. And typically I will invite that person to a 4th of July picnic afterward. The lectureship was set on the 4th of July, and my brother cleverly got that former gentleman who ran the corner office in the fundraising department with a haircut like mine, sold the 4th of July too cheap, and I've kidded him about that. And they wanted to take it away, and we said, no, a contract is a contract, we like it. But indeed, to have these people of significance there, to have younger members of the family share a meal with them and talk about substantive issues, and then to come back and in the afternoon go on, that is significant. And in fact, we've had many that have returned. We have someone who was almost 10 years ago who has agreed to be interviewed at this table next year, and his specialty is political science, and we will have him on Chautauqua People during an election year, presidential election year. And that's the values. And you may not agree fully with what he has to say, but it's thoughtful, it's a reasonable position. These are articulated, and the sort of person, like most, and who we'd like to bring on this program, would come back and give you a thoughtful response if he disagreed with the position you had taken.
Well, you've done exactly what is the ideal process of philanthropy. For you to already be engaged in Chautauqua, for you and your family to have discussed your values, to invested in Chautauqua in the 1045 platform, which is the core of the Chautauqua programming, and then to build relationships with the people whose lectures you have sponsored.
Mm-hmm.
So those are multiple relationships and satisfying to you, and I might add to the next generation in your family that see you and your siblings have demonstrated a value that hopefully will be passed on to the next generation of the V family.
Indeed, and as you're aware, when you were with the institution, we've left by bequest upon my demise some means to plus up that account, that lectureship substantially.
And I'll bet that that sense of philanthropy that has been fulfilling to you here may well have carried over into other aspects of your life in your home community.
It has
as well.
It has, and we look favorably upon those opportunities. There's simply not enough money to do everything that I would like, but indeed you say, what are the most significant items, and those are the ones that we will fund and take a walk around and squeeze some others to contribute to also. Now let's go a little further, and can you give us an example from your world of philanthropy, some people you work with over time who ended up being major contributors?
Well, you know, one of the nicest stories that I like to share took place when I was working for the University of Miami, and I was the development officer for the medical center. And a very generous man had established a significant gift to develop a center for the research and care of cancer patients. At the groundbreaking, I went up to this individual and I said to him, "Thank you so much for what you have done." And he said no. He said, "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the university. Thank you to your colleagues. You have enabled me to take the wealth that I accrued over a full career that was simply money. And now what you have done is enabled me to touch the lives of thousands of people, most of whom I will never know and who will be helped long after I leave this world. But because of that, the wealth that I worked so hard to achieve is now going to make a difference in the lives of thousands of people over the next years." And I realized that he was feeling a sense of connection to people long into the future that would be helped through this wonderful center in a time of their lives of distress, and that this was something that without this he could never have done. In addition, for the university and for most non-for-profits, they need significant gifts like that in order to scale up the work that they're doing, in order to expand their efforts, because typically a not-for-profit, a university of course is a big organization, but most not-for-profits are very small, and the only way they can expand the basic work of what they do is through a significant gift and somebody's vision of what that work could do with potentially additional resources.
And so that has a major effect upon a community, does it not?
Absolutely. And when you look at the number of not-for-profits all over this country, in large communities and small communities, in many places it's making the difference in the quality of life.
You know, for example, cancer is an easy one to find evidence that one's odds are so much higher if you become a cancer patient. If you're treated at a comprehensive cancer center, that deals with state-of-the-art therapies and evaluates itself and has enough subspecialists to really deal directly with what the problem is.
And to help to ensure the successful future of those patients and their families.
Indeed.
True.
Let's switch gears a little bit. When we've talked about nonprofits, I wonder if you could talk about how most nonprofits are governed, boards of trustees and what they do and how they're selected, and what differences there are among types of boards.
Not-for-profits live and die by the quality of their board of directors or board of trustees, different titles in different organizations. And one of the most important things for the sustainability and the effectiveness and the growth of a not-for-profit is the quality of people that are brought on the board. One of the mistakes that is often made is that a board is too homogeneous, and the most effective boards are boards that have a representation from the people who are being touched by the work of the board. They also have representation from the community leadership, people who have the networks to reach out to serve as ambassadors for the organization, to bring on people who have an interest and a commitment, perhaps have been touched in the past by the work of this organization, but to have that diversity of voices. Many boards serve in the capacity of an advisory board. They work with the staff, they help to set the policy for how the organization is going to work, but more and more boards are becoming what you would call working boards. They have committees, they have a committee structure, and the committees really have tasks, and they are held accountable for fulfilling those tasks, those objectives. And I think there are a couple of things here that make that concept of a working board important. Younger people, I'm talking about young professionals who have the capacity to support a not-for-profit, but they want to be engaged. They want to make sure that their investment is doing what they envision the ability of that organization to do with their investment. And so serving on a board is a way of kind of getting their fingers into the operation and making sure that it's working, that it's doing what it's supposed to do. Also, I think an important thing to remember is the amount of money that is controlled by women in this country. 7 years ago, in 2012, women controlled 50% of the wealth in this country. Statistics show that women tend to outlive men. So if a couple has accrued wealth, it's going to be, at some point, likely to be controlled by the female spouse. Today, fully 70% of the wealth in the United States is controlled by women. Women who have been volunteers over the years, when they are invited to serve on boards, they like to get involved in the program of the organization. They want to make sure that the clients are actually being served. They want to make sure that the arts projects that are envisioned are actually taking place. They want to know how the organization is running. They want to see how the leaders lead. And I think that these are two factors in the rationale for what we call working boards, which are becoming more and more common, rather than at boards that serve in advisory capacity or helping to open doors. Those are certainly important, but the working boards are increasingly critical.
Now, do you find working boards more common in large or small organizations? Is there a relationship there?
Probably more in smaller organizations, but I look at the board of the Chautauqua Institution, and that's, I would call it a medium-sized board, but those people work hard. You served on that board for a number of years. And there are active committees. They have work to do. They are certainly committed to the mission of the institution, and they work hard, spend a lot of time and effort, and I think find it very rewarding. The institution is very good about saying thank you to their donors, to their volunteers. They do that very well, but people are involved and they work hard, spend a lot of time at this.
Now that is significant, and I know I could talk about some projects. I was up till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning writing paragraphs about how this, that, or the other should be done. And they were discussed appropriately, and we moved along. And I think most of the people, as I understand now, on Chautauqua board would work that hard when it was necessary to do it.
Absolutely.
Now, let's switch gears a little bit. And one of the tough deals is this matter of the role of tax deductions in philanthropy. And you've seen lots of gifts over the years. Can you sort of roll up where we stand now and what significance you really see that playing?
You know, I think the verdict is out. There are a number of different opinions about the effect of the decision to make charitable gifts no longer tax deductible. And people who are committed to an organization and have the ability to make a gift, I believe, are going to continue to do that. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier about values. If something is important, then you're going to support it. I hope that charitable giving will continue to be tax deductible, because it says, it's a message from our government saying private support of charities is an important value for our country. And I don't think there are very many people who believe that the government should be filling all of those gaps. There is a role for government, but there is a role for the private sector as well, be it private business, and of course the vast majority of donors who are private individuals.
Yeah, for example, this channel, Access Chautauqua, is a 501(c), and indeed I believe it does some wonderful things for the community, Central Chautauqua County, that wouldn't be done if it was simply a government agency. And programs like this are examples.
And it's done simply. It's done often on a shoestring.
Indeed.
And yet it garners public support, and there would be a real loss to the community if it were no longer able to function. And I think we see that repeated again and again across the country.
Right. Now, one more issue, then we're going to talk about Chautauqua here. Are there different sorts of issues which the large and the small nonprofits tend to focus upon? If you would look at the size of a nonprofit, could you make a prediction and say, perhaps they're interested in this, that, or the other?
When there is a need in a community, typically people gather together. One of the problems with not-for-profits is that they are very narrow in their scope, and that prevents them from growing. One of the best things that happens in a community is when the leadership in a not-for-profit reaches out to other organizations where their missions may overlap. The people that they work with may have similar problems, and then ultimately may affiliate together. Typically those things start by perhaps sponsoring an event, a fundraising event in a shared capacity, and then sharing the results or the money that is donated. I think when we see organizations build a longer track record, they are the ones that have that leadership, the resources, the community support, and are really filling a genuine need in a community. Mm-hmm. A lot of not-for-profits do not manage to live a long life. Now, Chautauqua is in its 146th season, so clearly there have been people, and there have been difficult times for Chautauqua financially, but there have been enough people committed to the mission of Chautauqua that they have stepped forward and done what was necessary to sustain it.
Can you tell me a little more in detail about their fundraising activities?
Well, you know, I'm no longer involved
Right.
on the inside at Chautauqua, but I have great respect for the way Chautauqua operates. And Chautauqua tends to be very sensitive to the ideas and the needs of Chautauquans. Even though there is frustration when a group of people want to get something going and they think they can raise money and they want the institution to give them the support, the institution has a lot on its plate. So I think it wants people to join together and get something started on their own. And after building a track record, then the institution tends to be willing to offer its support. But you look around the grounds and how many of the activities are started just by a group of people wanting to do something. And you know, we could name a half dozen things. One of the things I'm thinking about, that one of the longest running organizations at the institution is the CLSC, the long-running book club going back to 1878 and having a storied history. In recent years, there were a group of people of Chautauquans out of the world of science and technology who felt that the books were not sufficiently geared toward the sciences. And they said, all right, we're going to start our own organization, or a kind of an offshoot, still part of the CLSC, but it's the CLSC Science group. And they have programs, they have speakers, they have books that they read. And so it's very much a grassroots from the visitors to Chautauqua who have common interests or see a need, they can get that started.
And those programs tend to be very substantive too, do they not?
Absolutely. I think with Chautauquans, if they were not substantive, they wouldn't have a long life.
Right, right. Now we are almost out of time, and I'd like to give our guests a moment to sort of have closing comments. What else do we need to cover from your perspective?
I'd like to close by thinking a little bit about families and family estates, and reminding our viewers that typically when children are given large inheritances, $1 million, even in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, that statistics show us that within a very small period of time, that money is gone. As people will say, if you give the kids millions of dollars, they're going to screw it up. Mm-hmm. And statistics show you, how many times have we said, oh, if I only could win the lottery, I could do X, Y, Z. And people who win the lottery, that money is gone within most likely a year or two, it's gone. So my suggestion and my belief is that philanthropy can play a very important role in helping the next generation, the next 2 generations, to understand the value of philanthropy. And if they are started at a young age with the examples like you have given to your family, and they say, all right, support for the arts, or support for intellectual opportunities, support for our church, support for our university or our school. These are the things that our family cares about. Many young people, their #1 concern is climate change, and they want to be able to support environmental efforts. And to pass along that value of philanthropy and demonstrating that through giving, and giving children and grandchildren the opportunity to begin support for philanthropy at an early age. My firm belief is that that is going to preserve the wealth of the family, preserve the effectiveness of the values of a family, far more than just handing over sums of money to the next generation.
Indeed. That's a wonderful point to end our conversation. We're out of time, and this has been so much fun. And I hope our viewers will listen to this program a couple times and hear what you've had to say. Thank you so very much.
Thank
and
you.
do come back.
This has been a pleasure, John. Thank
By all
you.
means.